Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of New Role, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Nina Spencer, founder and CEO of Addidat, an ESG data and analytics company focused on the AIM market, and Ned at Greenstone, an ESG solution provider, Wilton & Bain, an executive search firm, and AIM-listed Lendvest, a mortgage lending company. Before her non-executive career, Nina worked at Morgan Stanley and Accenture before spending 15 years as a consulting and fintech executive at Alpha Financial Markets Consulting, a global consultant for the asset management, wealth management, and insurance industries, where she was global COO and CEO of Alpha Data Solutions. With a wealth of ESG experience, particularly in the AIM market, Nina is well placed to consider the environment, social and governance challenges and opportunities boards face today. Her positions as founder, CEO, and Ned give her insights into the CEO board dynamic. And having taken on 3 non-executive positions in the last 2 years, her thoughts on how to make the jump from executive to non-executive work will be invaluable to those at the early stages of their board careers. Nina, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
You're clearly an ESG thought leader, helping organizations, particularly in the AIM market, set their strategies and navigating the complexity of reporting using data. It's an enormous area with loads of acronyms, which can make some people feel incredibly uncomfortable. If I'm listening to this podcast now and not yet comfortable with how to approach ESG as a board member, what is the framework that you have in mind for navigating that landscape?
Yes, it's a great question. And I completely recognise and I think felt very similarly about ESG when it was something that started to come under my radar. And so I think one of the things that we've started to think about with Addidat and the way that we think about ESG is to really look at that, even that acronym, and try and work out what does fit into it. There isn't a universal definition. There is nothing that says what is in or out. And therefore, it is open to interpretation. So I think the first step is for any kind of board member or senior exec thinking about ESG is to have that kind of appreciation for what could and should fit into each of those categories for their organization. And so, you can come up with a really neat structure that outlines, okay, these are the things that we will kind of consider within our E scope, within the S scope and the G scope. And then equally, where do we as an organization and a business want to put our emphasis and focus? Because it won't be on everything that fits into all of those things. I think I could probably list 60 topics, 60 areas that could fall under ESG in its broadest sense. And I think it really then just comes down to how do you want to think about them and kind of, do something proactively about them within your own organization.
Brilliant. Gosh, 60 different topics. I mean, on your website, on your Addidat website, you have it beautifully laid out with, I think it's sort of 5 to 6 main headings under each of those titles. So under environmental, you've got climate change, carbon emissions and air pollution, water conservation, deforestation and sustainable land use and recycling efforts. Are those the ones that you think of as being the key, or what's the difference between the 15 or so that you've got there versus the 60 that you say are possibles?
So the ones you've just listed all fit in the E categorization. Then if you look at governance is fascinating because clearly there's things that are fairly obvious. What's the board construct like? How independent is it? What's the gender diversity on it? What are the reporting metrics that are being used? But then more broadly than that, within governance, you could cover cybersecurity. What's your tax policy? What's your kind of approach to looking at remunerations? There's a whole wealth of things that could fit into kind of governance of an organization that fit within the G that don't necessarily come kind of top of mind when people think about the ESG acronym first off. And I think there's typically been a kind of a steer for people to think of ESG and use it interchangeably with environment. And actually it's not. I don't know why the 3 areas of environment, social and governance were all put under the same acronym, because they actually cover a huge spectrum of things, but they are under one area now. And therefore it's really important to understand what fits across those 3 spaces before jumping in and coming up with a strategy or a roadmap for ESG without having that understanding of the entire kind of ecosystem that lives within it.
Yeah, really interesting. So in your experience, you're helping a lot of boards navigate this as well as on your own boards, but where do boards and board members typically run into challenges?
So I think the reason why I think this is such a difficult area and why we've looked to kind of try to solve some of the problems is because it is quite amorphous and it is quite unclear. And actually, I think there is a natural kind of concern when jumping in and thinking about ESG, of making sure you're doing the right thing at the right time. So what we have been working with boards, and really the idea behind Addidat, is to say, well, look, actually, before we go and make any decisions around our ESG strategy or what we're going to do as a roadmap, let's understand what that term means, what it covers. And then when we look at that broader sense, what does that mean to us as a business? Which things are relevant? Because there will be very different kind of, areas of focus across the E and the S and the G, depending on the type of organization that you are and what you're focused on delivering to clients. Once you've got that understanding of what ESG means and what it means to your organization, you can then go down to the next level saying, okay, well, there's lots we could be doing. There's a plethora of things you could do for ESG, but actually, where are we going to get the biggest kind of return for that investment? Be that return directly in terms of bottom line valuation, be that in terms of employee engagement, employee retention, customer satisfaction, many, many things that will influence kind of your strategy around ESG. How do we understand which of those are going to give us the biggest kind of, return for our investment in this space? And then thirdly, and this was the bit that really was missing in terms of my understanding when I started talking about this, both as an exec at Alpha and then now as a non-exec on boards, was, well, what are others doing and how are they doing it? How do we understand what my peer group is doing and therefore where I want to position myself against them? So, AIM is, as you say, is the area that we're really focused on. It's certainly the market that I'm always been most closely kind of working within. And AIM in itself is, it's a huge breadth of organizations on it, about 820, 830 listed at the moment, covering all of the various subsectors. And what those organizations are doing and how they're doing it also varies hugely. Some have really put themselves out and said, we are going to be market leading and visionary in this space, and we want to be ahead of our peer group. Others are very much kind of thinking, we're just taking the first steps into this. We don't really even understand what the regulatory requirements are that we need to be hitting, let alone anything above and beyond that. And so by pulling together this kind of data that we've pulled together with Addidat, the idea behind it is to be able to say, well, look, let's go to those organizations and just explain, okay, well, what are the AIM 100 doing? Or what are your subsector of AIM doing? What, if we take environment as an example, what initiatives are typically being adopted? Are people adopting TCFD? When are they adopting it? Are they delivering GHG scope calculations and emissions? Are they doing it for scope 1, 2, and or 3? And then once they are doing it, if they're doing it, what are those numbers saying? And I think without that kind of, information and understanding of what your peer group, what your market, what your competitors are doing, it's very difficult, I think, to, in isolation, sit at a board table and say, right, this is what we're going to do about ESG, and this is why we think this is the right prioritization for us as a business. So that's, I think, driven a lot of the discussion. And I think another really common kind of, consideration that we see with companies, and again, I've seen it sitting in different board tables, is often it's, say, the employee group that's coming up to the board or coming up to the exec and saying, right, group within our business or this individual is really passionate about a carbon zero, net zero target, or really passionate about a better LGBTQ plus engagement program across the business. And these things filter up to the board or filter up to the exec. And it's very difficult to know, like, how do you say yes or no to those things? Because clearly, I'd hope everybody would be very on board with the idea of, reducing our carbon output, having better inclusivity programs, including more kind of, social impact within your business. But you can't do everything. And therefore, having a kind of a framework to understand, well, look, this is everything we could be doing. This is what we are doing. This is what our peers are doing. And therefore, this is why we're building out the subsequent roadmap. And that being really, based in confident, accurate, concise, relevant, up-to-date data, I think is something which hasn't been there previously. And so that's why I think it's really important boards kind of take the time to make that assessment before they go and do something, before they go and kind of make a decision or head down a path, which retrospectively you may look at and kind of go, oh, actually, have we done it in the right order? Are we overspending, underspending? Where do we need to be compared to everyone else?
Really interesting. You talked there about prioritizing and thinking about the return on investment of the different initiatives. Can you maybe talk me through an example of how you might do that? Because on one level, I could see that. I could see, well, if we invest into our sort of, mental health support, we should be able to drive down our sick days or our employee churn by X%, and that could be worth, Y million or whatever it might be. But is that the sort of thing that is that the way you are thinking about that return on investment? Or maybe can you bring it to life with an example of where you were wrestling with two different initiatives and how you evaluated it? Because it strikes me that often with some of these things, they're not always easy to subject to that analytical evaluation.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly right. So they're not all quantifiable in terms of kind of bottom line numbers. It's definitely not that simple. But I think what is important is when looking at each of these potential ESG initiatives that an organisation could run, understanding what's driving the value of doing that initiative. Is the pressure coming from the employee group, your investors, your brokers, regulatory requirements, your client base? So who is it that wants or needs to see this change, and what's driving that request? And therefore, what are the potential benefits and outcomes of doing it? So, actually, the mental health program is a great example, right? So yes, would there quantifiably be some data that says, you could reduce people's kind of, time out of the office on the basis of them having kind of better mental health support? Absolutely. I'm sure you could pull together some data that does it. Equally, I think where it becomes kind of, non-quantitative but very qualitative is then saying, well, actually, when we bring new employees on board, or when we're talking about recruitment, this is a strategy we've put in place. And therefore, we can articulate that, and that might incentivize people to join or retain or stay with us longer term. And equally, I think what's becoming more interesting is where then those additional stakeholders, so where your investor group or your shareholders are asking you around what you're doing around the social kind of aspect of your business, to be able to then credibly argue, that's why you've prioritized this thing within your business over and above something else, I think really does start to add clarity to your strategy, and hopefully in turn people wanting to make more investment in your business because you've practically said what it is you're doing to be differentiated against your peer group in that space.
Really interesting. Before we dive down into the sort of the individual components of the ESG, just curious to know, based on your experience, where do you see boards and board members most often getting it wrong? And can you give me some examples to bring that to life?
Yeah, so I think where people are getting it wrong at the moment, or potentially getting it wrong, as I said before, is either kind of over committing to something without understanding the ramifications of it. So I had a great example where we had a board who had signed up to the Principles of Responsible Investment, which is one of the many initiatives you could be signed up under an ESG guise. And they signed up to 18 months, then read it in detail and realized that they're not an asset manager, they're not investing funds, and therefore it's completely irrelevant. So then they subsequently had to say, we've now removed our signatory from, so you're no longer signed up to Principles Responsible Investment. It's just, and clearly it doesn't make any sense for them to have signed up in the first place. But those kind of missets are just quite awkward and embarrassing, and things you just don't want to have to manage post event. I gave you the example of kind of signing up too quickly to a net zero target and then actually not understanding all of the steps that would need to be taken to get you from where you are today to where you need to be. Another big kind of area of potential concern at the moment is something where we've had this kind of huge swathe of popularity around the idea of carbon offsetting and kind of paying for your carbon credits via reforestation programs or charities that helping you do that. And I think there's been a lot in the press recently about how some of the traceability of quite how neutral those carbon credits are have been really put into doubt. And so actually, should organizations naturally be saying very quickly, right, we've got ourselves to being net carbon neutral because we've bought all these credits? Or is it actually more beneficial to say, no, what we're going to do is really understand what it is we're using in carbon, and then our strategy is going to be, how can we mitigate and reduce that, not just simply offset it? I think that's kind of solved the problem for us, because actually that hasn't solved the problem for us. And I had an example where we had an annual report we were reading the other week, and it said something like, this year we've increased our carbon credits by X many thousands, etc. And it was almost there as a kind of I think a piece of kind of marketing and value. And actually what you're saying there is, we've increased our carbon usage and therefore we've had to increase our kind of carbon offsetting. So you need to be really careful that if you're going to put those kind of terms and phrases in your reports, that everybody that's putting them in understands what the underlying message is there, and that actually it's not a good thing to have a larger carbon offsetting number. It's actually a bad thing. You should be aiming to reduce that, not increase it over time with productivity.
I'm interested to dive down a bit more into the sort of the EE bit to start with. And I recently came across some interesting data that suggests that a high percentage of companies on AIM neither reporting nor taking active measures to reduce their GHG emissions. And that's interestingly been sort of backed up by what we're hearing from some of our AIM members in the mastermind groups that we do for the New Role community, who've been sort of suggesting that ESG has slipped down the priority list because of economic pressures. Do you have a sense for how well AIM companies are performing, and to what extent does that vary by sector, company size, and what are the other variables driving that?
Great question. So I think, what our data shows at the moment, if you look at like the last financial year of, what companies have reported in the last 12 months, it's about a third of AIM companies that are currently kind of producing some GHG metrics. Now, as I say before, there is a wealth of difference between a scope 1, a scope 2, and a scope 3 kind of declaration. And so a third are kind of, reporting something. Clearly, scope 2 is typically the most straightforward. What's your kind of energy usage and energy bills? And then scope 1 often is kind of reported alongside that. Scope 3 is much, much newer, and far fewer organizations are reporting that yet. I think it's something like 15-20% maximum are reporting scope 3 as it stands today. So I think you're right to say that it is still a relatively small percentage of AIM listed businesses that are doing it today. It does vary slightly by sector. There are some sectors where clearly, probably because they've had more scrutiny and there's an expectation that it's something that's of greater importance to them, they typically have moved further along that kind of journey. So energy companies, base metal companies, companies where typically investors might ask this thing more readily of them, have done more to try and address it. And there are other sectors where very little has been reported to date. I think it's interesting, the point you make around, are people seeing ESG fall down the agenda in terms of, and reporting on some of these things falling down their agenda? And I guess I probably have, from my experience, a slightly different view, which is people saying, we do need to do something and we do want to do something about ESG, but we don't want to do the wrong thing or overinvest in the wrong way. And so it just comes back to almost that confidence that says there has to be a benefit to us doing this. There has to be a benefit to our business, and it has to be a very clearly understood benefit. And we need to ensure that we're not jumping ahead of ourselves or falling behind others. And once I think you get a board or a business comfortable with that benefit, I think the desire to do it is still there, actually. And I think something like GHG emissions and that, I think it's something that we've seen even in society. You think about the amount that this is on people's minds and how this is growing in people's kind of awareness of what they're doing in their own lives, and the amount of recycling we do. Or as you say, are we buying our own electric cars? Are we all thinking a little bit more before we book that extra flight somewhere? I think we are all naturally doing that now as a society, and therefore if a board is doing its job effectively, it should be reflecting some of those behaviours within its kind of decision making, because clearly, an effective business will be a business that's modelled on what a society wants it to deliver, because that will be a business that then, will be successful ultimately in what it's trying to achieve.
And so when you go into a company for the first time, are there particular measures that you look out for?
So what we do, and again, this really comes back to the way we've tried to build Addidat, is we absolutely don't go into a company and ask them to provide us with any information whatsoever. What we've done is, if we've used across the AIM network all of the information that is publicly available in all of the different places it's available, so annual reports, sustainability reports if they're produced, the LSE website, the gender pay gap reporting framework, the initiatives that people are adopting. So we've gathered that together into our data set, and then we maintain that on a monthly basis. So as new annual reports are released or financials are released, that's automatically ingested into our data set. And so therefore, when we go and speak to a company, typically the conversation is, look, would you like us to show you, with very little input on your side, would you like us to show you everything you're saying that you're doing around ESG across these 60, 70 different metrics that you could be mapped against? And then would you like us to show you what your peer group are doing or your aspirational peer group are doing? So would you like to be moving up towards the AIM 100? How far are they advanced in their gender pay gap numbers or their gender diversity on their boards, or whatever the different metrics are that we can offer? And actually very quickly, that then gives that board, I think, a framework to understand where that business sits alongside everybody else. And I think that's the bit that certainly conversations I was having, and the thought process I was having was, I'd really like to know that about the companies that I'm not sitting on their board tables. And what are others doing? And so that's what I think we're offering with this solution.
Makes complete sense. I suppose once you've got an organization who's clear on where its peers are, clear on where it's going, what are the things that then are sort of holding them back from delivering on that and doing more? Are there common challenges that organizations face at that point?
So I think it will always come down to, the amount that's available to invest. And I think it's really important with it. I'm very passionate about ESG. It's clearly something I've decided to try and kind of form a business around. But equally, I'm also, I've been in and around businesses for a very long time. And actually, bottom line is that they need to be successful and profitable, and they need to grow, and they need to, deliver shareholder value, and they need to deliver kind of employee growth. And so this is one of many things that organizations need to do. And so I think that in order to get that balance right, I think it's really reasonable for a company to say, I now understand where I am, as you say, against everybody else. I now understand all the things I could do or may want to do. But my decision, or our decision around this board table, is we are going to prioritize this 1, 2, 3, 5 things, however many is relevant to us, for this reason and these reasons. And I think once you've done that, as with any decision in life, once you've done that and you think you've gone through kind of the due process of understanding why you've made that decision, why you've prioritized or deprioritized other things, you understand that yourselves, and you can therefore articulate that to all of those other stakeholders around your organization, internally and externally. I think that just gives your strategy a huge amount of kind of, credibility. And actually, I think it's totally legitimate for a CEO to say about his or her business, well, actually, in the next 2 years, our focus for these reasons is really going to heavily be on cybersecurity and, employee engagement and retention. And therefore, we're focusing the initiatives on these things or these TG goals that align with, this part of our business. And therefore, we're going to wait to worry about GHG emissions or environmental factors further down the line. And I think that you can't do everything at once and you can't do everything at the same time. And therefore, just build a sensible, credible plan for your business that aligns with where you think you're going to get the most value from it. And I think fundamentally, the key is, I think there is real, genuine business value in getting this right. I obviously don't see it as a tick box exercise. I see it as something that really will add huge weight to the value of an organization if they get it right.
If you take aside the kind of businesses which are, heavily energy dependent or, obvious candidates for focus around E, what are the sorts of benefits, quantifiable benefits that you most see organizations tapping into when they're looking through that economic lens? Is it primarily the sort of, employee benefits, brand?
I think there's huge untapped kind of, relatively straightforward benefit to be had. So a really simple one is if you look at email usage and email storage within organizations, most organizations will have if they've got one at all, they'll have a very dated, very kind of obscure policy around archiving emails. And every email we send will all be stored somewhere and stored for the next 5, 10, 15 years, who knows? And not only that, but, you and I have had an email exchange of 10 emails and all 10 of those get saved down to the very last one where I say, thanks, Oliver. And, that's it. They all get stored away. And actually just understanding what the kind of the carbon value is of those stored emails is enormous. And so if you came up with a policy and, we're working with companies now that come up with a policy that says, there are certain individuals within our organization for certain reasons, who do want to retain these things for a very long time, our C-suite, our CFO, whoever. There are certain kind of, requirements for us to do that to make sure we've got the right kind of framework. But, for the vast majority of this group of employees or this, part of our business, we have a 2-year retention policy or a 5-year retention policy, and we can just delete them. That's just a net win for everything, right? That's a ton of carbon that's been saved. The cost of that storage being, somewhere it's being stored and you're paying for that to be stored somewhere, and the value of being able to kind of say to your company, here's something that we're doing, which has got really zero impact on you at all as an employee, but has got this kind of intrinsic value to both the world and our cost base. That's really valuable. So I think there are lots of examples like that where people, I think, and that's why I think we look at ESG as being a relatively broad brush of things that can fall within it. And actually there are kind of pockets of real value that are there to be tapped into if companies take the time to think about it.
I love that. I'm going to go check our archive policy after this. Are there any other sort of gems like that where you regularly see organizations having, value locked away that they could easily tap into on that E front?
So I think the other thing, I guess, speaking to companies about now, that comes back to, say, the GHG calculations and the fact that not everybody is doing them today. And I think where people are doing them, what you'll find is in an annual report, there will be a table, and the table will say, here's our GHG scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for the last 12 months. And that sits in that report. You may or may see that at the board in some kind of, draft version of that report. And they're just some static numbers and they don't really tell you anything at all. And so actually, again, what we've been able to do with our benchmark data is be able to say to companies, well, look, let's now benchmark that number against your peer group. And then you can start to really understand where you are in that. So is that number bigger, smaller, the same as everybody else? And actually, even in the worst case scenario, even if that number's worse than your peer group, if you now understand that and you understand that that's larger than others, based on number of employees, market cap, geographies, whatever the metrics are that we've used to kind of to parameterize that, you now understand it's bigger, you'll naturally be incentivized to reduce it. And therefore, instead of that being a negative thing to go to market or go to your investors with, it becomes a really positive story to say, look, we've understood this, we calculate it, and lots of our peers don't. We've understood what it is and why the number is what it is, which others don't. And now we're going to look to address it, which many others aren't thinking about. I think there was a lot of value in, as you know, numerous funds and investors and segregated accounts out there where companies are saying, or organizations, individuals are saying, we want to invest in businesses where they are proactively helping with ESG and that want to put our money into organizations where there is genuinely kind of positive steps being made to address these items. That's a great story to be able to go out and then say, well, look, we're a company that's taking this really seriously, have thought about it, and they're now doing something about it. There's value in that.
Have you ever experienced situations where, either on boards you've been on or that you've worked with, where the CEO didn't buy into it and the board did, and resolving that tension?
Absolutely. So I think, as with many things that happen on boards, I think getting a consensus view on any topic from day one is unlikely. And certainly I think we've dealt with that scenario where there have been C-suite or executives that have said, we don't see the value of this, and boards that have. And maybe a great example of that might be diversity. So, the gender pay gap reporting, where, a CEO and is sitting there day in, day out just thinking, gosh, I've got so much to do. I've got this great team of people. They're all doing really well. I just can't think about, these wider factors around what the kind of, the dynamic and makeup of that senior team is in any detail. I just need everyone to get on with what they're doing. And actually, I think that's where the value of a board comes in, to be able to say, look, day in, day out, you are getting the job done. But the bigger picture is you do need to consider the fact that we are outlying in terms of where we sit against our peer group and elsewhere in terms of our diversity at senior levels. And that, this might not bite you today, but it will bite you tomorrow. And I think that's part of a board's kind of, expectation and requirement, is to challenge those things and kind of take that step back and say, we need a strategy to address this longer term, and let's think about how we do that. And I think, again, gender pay gap is a really fascinating one, because you will find that, obviously, as you'd expect, different sectors across AIM have vastly different pay gaps generally, as you would expect. And I think probably no huge surprise, basic materials and mining have a much bigger gap than, say, telecommunications and retail in terms of kind of, senior execs and kind of pay gap differentiators. Again, I think up to now, there's only been the knowledge that you're aiming for parity, but how you get there, what that looks like, is really difficult to ascertain. Whereas if you now are able to say to yourself, we're a basic materials company, let's look at where our peer group are. We've got, 10% diversity of senior women across the business, and therefore our gender pay gap is huge. What is everyone else doing? Oh gosh, well, the best in our class has got 15, 20%, and the worst has got 5%. So we're actually middle of our sector. We didn't know that before. That's helpful. It doesn't mean we want to stay there, but at least we know we're in the middle. We're not bottom, we're in the middle. And actually, therefore, our strategy should be not to aim for like 50% in the next 2-3 years, because that's completely unrealistic, but let's set ourselves a target for aiming for 20% or 25%. And actually, that requires us taking on 1 or 2 more heads, not an unrealistic, 5 senior recruits in the next kind of 3 years at senior levels with women, which would just be completely unachievable in most cases. So I think it's about allowing organizations to understand where they sit today and then create really sensible, manageable, achievable targets to make changes. And coming back to your example, that's where I think it's much easier for that CEO in that scenario where he or she sits and kind of going, gosh, I've got no time to think about this and it's unachievable anyway, to kind of go, well, actually, we can't achieve all of it in year 1, but we can start to make some really sensible steps forward, and we can set ourselves measurable targets in the meantime to get us there. Another thing which we're increasingly seeing at board level, which I think is really helpful, is where those senior execs and C-suite are having some of these measures put into their remuneration calculations and bonus calculations. So measures in there that say we want to see kind of demonstrable kind of improvement or change or commitment to some of these areas. But again, I think if I were the CEO or COO on the receiving end of that expectation within my remuneration package, I would only feel comfortable if I felt it was achievable. So, how do you make that target achievable? And I think that again comes back to having a wider set of data available to you to say, well, this does feel achievable. Adding 5% on here should be doable. Adding 60% is not achievable. So, allowing parameters to be set that are realistic, I think then increases buy-in to the idea of doing something.
I want to go back to something you touched on at the beginning there, which was that disconnect between the CEO perspective and the board perspective, because I've certainly experienced that where a CEO just had so much else on their plate and they were focused on all this other stuff. And the board, felt that they needed to get this longer term thinking integrated into their sort of short term planning. I'm curious to understand what in your experience is, why is there that disconnect? You've got smart people on both sides of the table, and sometimes those can be incredibly difficult conversations. What drives the divergence in views, do you think? Because ultimately, they're both sides of it are looking to do what's best for the business. What do you think is at the root of that disconnect typically?
I think you could argue that's disconnect, or you could argue that that's actually kind of exactly what that dynamic should be to some extent. Because I think, your priorities, as you said at the top of this podcast, I've been the global COO of a business, been the CEO of a business within that, so I've had those kind of daily pressures of delivering against kind of, those annual targets, that kind of annual need to deliver. And so that was quite rightly the thing that I day in day out would be focused upon. And actually, I think that's where some of the value of the independence of a board comes in, because you need others to then come along and say to you, well, actually, that's all well and good for delivering this year's results, but if you're going to look 2, 3, 4 years out, we need to be thinking bigger, broader. These other things are happening out in the world or in other organizations I'm sitting within that you may not be aware of. And so I think that kind of tension, it is almost where I think boards are being really effective, and it doesn't need to be conflict for it to be tension. But I think that kind of awareness of different perspectives and the executive team saying, look, we can't, I think it's very easy to get a senior kind of C-suite executive to a point of saying, I agree with you, I just haven't got the bandwidth to do it. Because then you're already halfway through that discussion, right? Because then it comes down to not, do you think this is the right thing to do or not? Intellectually, it's, you can't fit that in with everything else you're doing. That's a very reasonable thing to argue. Therefore, how do we solve that problem? How do we address the challenge around resourcing it or scoping it or sizing it? And how do we give you or the team the space to achieve that? So you're already opened up that dialogue and you're moving in the right direction. But I do feel as though, having a board dynamic that allows for that kind of discussion to take place is actually really, really helpful. Because, I worked at Alpha for 15 years and grew through that organization, became the global CEO of that business. I was very, very good at understanding how to manage that business, manage the teams in that business. I spent absolutely none of my week looking at what other companies were doing or how they were doing it, or, what others were thinking about in terms of longer term strategy. I was just delivering the strategy we had to deliver for that year. And so without the support of those external kind of, NEDs, board members, other senior members of the board sitting there saying, you need to think about these wider things as well, or this is what we're seeing happening elsewhere, that would have been a real shame. That would have really lacked in our longer term vision.
I want to move on and talk a bit about the social aspect of it. Interested to know, you sort of, again, in your breakout of social, you talk about gender and diversity, inclusion, mental health support, working standards and policies, amongst other things. What, for you, if you're going into a board the first time, are you looking out for in terms of measuring an organization's social performance? Are there specific measures, and are there those which are specific to AIM, or are they sort of common across organizations in your experience?
Yeah, so I think there's very little which is, in terms of kind of ESG, which is specific to a market. I think we're not at that point of evolution. So most regulations across ESG, the ones that do exist, they will be predicated on things like the size of the organization, the number of employees, the size of revenue. So it's kind of those kind of factors just then tip you into a point where you need to do your TCFD reporting, or you need to do your gender pay gap reporting, or you need to have a modern anti-slavery statement. So whatever those things are, really it's dependent on the size of the organization and some parameters around it, rather than whether it's listed, unlisted, AIM listed, etc. I think the reason why for us we're focusing on AIM is because they have to then present that data out to the public market in a way that private equity companies don't have to. To answer your question around kind of social, I think for us it's looking at all of those factors at the outset. So are they meeting the regulatory requirements of having everything in place they should have? So in terms of employee rights policies, modern anti-slavery statement policies around employee engagement, etc. So what do they have in place for that? Then what do they have in place in terms of kind of programs, initiatives, frameworks in place to support their staff and team members? Again, that will change and become much more specific based upon sector. So when you start looking at some of the kind of, industrial sectors, they will have very specific additional policies or committees around things like health and safety. They will have to kind of, or opt to report on injuries or deaths in, work environments if they're kind of, production companies or industrial companies, which clearly is not something you have to kind of particularly measure if you're a communications company. So, it really depends on the nature of the business. And so, by sector, we can look at all of those factors and say, where are you today against those things? And then equally, it's about kind of where do you want to, or where should you be thinking about moving forward in order to retain employees, to, grow your business? What are the areas of most importance? So the kind of debates that are being had at board tables today around that, particularly in our kind of post-COVID world, would be things like, what's our work from home policy? And that's really fraught with a lot of discussion and questions around how do you get that right? We're in this for the first time, okay? It was almost easier when we were in the complete lockdown zone. It was like, well, this is the answer. Everyone's locked up at home. We're going to have to find ways of making that accessible to everybody. And equally, during that period of time when we were all locked up at home, it was very natural for everyone to kind of say halfway through a Zoom call, oh, sorry, guys, I've just got to go and answer the doorbell because it's my Tesco's delivery and I could only get this one slot and that's it. Or, sorry, guys, the dog's barking because, he's been locked up all day, we haven't for a walk. That all became very normal behaviour because it needed to be. And then we were in the post-COVID world where I think there's now a huge range of expectation across employees as to whether that is the new norm and I should be able to work from home 24/7 and be based wherever I like and have those interruptions or be off screen, like turn my video off when I'm at home so you can't actually see me, right through to others who will say, why isn't everybody back in the office 5 days a week as per the base case back in the past? And so how do you create a framework that balances those things out and gives you the employee engagement, retention, and productivity that you need as a business? And so those are the kind of policies where getting that right is something that I think is challenging boards at the moment from a social perspective.
Really interesting. Well, one of the ones that particularly interests me is the whole sort of diversity and inclusion piece. And I sometimes worry that organizations focus too much on the points of difference and having the points of difference as part of that diversity rather than really measuring the level of inclusion. So, we look at our psychological safety, measure psychological safety within the organization. Do people feel there is a safe space? And various sort of questions in our people analytics stuff that pulls through, can people bring their best selves to work and things like that? What do you see as best practice on that front of moving beyond just the sort of tick box? Yes, we've got, a series of photos we can put up on our board to show that we're a diverse board, to actually showing that this runs through the veins of the organization. This is a truly inclusive organization and beyond the lip service of the executive narrative.
I think it's a great question. And actually, I think about this a lot, as you would expect. And so firstly, I think with diversity, if you actually boil down, is there value in having diversity across an organization? I think the answer is yes. But what is that value? And exactly to your point, the value is not having a tick box list of people who look different. diversity in the photographs. But what you're actually trying to achieve with diversity is diversity of thought. That's where the value is. And actually what you want, whether it's the board table or anywhere in the organization, is a collective group of people with different life experiences, different kind of, knowledge, different backgrounds that allow them to have different perspectives on what you're doing as an organization, and therefore inform your kind of business and delivery model. And so for me, diversity comes back to diversity of thinking. And so that in itself is really important. And to your point, I think for diversity of thinking to work effectively, you don't only need the people to be in the positions, but you need them to be able to do their job well. And so that diversity and that diversity of thought doesn't even limit itself to, ethnicity or gender. It comes down to, neurodiversity is a huge area that's just really being tapped into in terms of understanding the value of having people within your organization that have proactively felt comfortable enough to identify as somebody with a particular neurodiverse skill set. And, some of those skill sets are hugely important. I think GCHQ have just come out and with proactively a campaign to say, we want more neurodiverse candidates to come and apply for some of these roles because they are incredibly good at solving some of these kind of most complex kind of codes and coding challenges. And so I think that's where the key lies for me in terms of getting D&I right. It's understanding what are the skill sets that you need across your organization to be most effective, and how can we find the right people to do those roles, whoever they might be. So that's where I think, and then once they're in those roles, how are they doing them effectively? So exactly to your point, people don't typically align with a D&I strategy, but we would put within that kind of remit is employee engagement surveys and feedback studies anonymously and openly within kind of, forums where that's possible. So I think that level of understanding of where your employee base sits is really important in understanding whether they are able, as you say, to bring their best self to work and their most authentic self, because once you're in that space, you will deliver your best outcome for the business.
Really interesting. And what about on the mental health support? That's obviously been a sort of a big thing, I think, post-COVID. It seems there's a sort of growing awareness of it as an issue. What are you seeing as sort of best practice from boards in tracking that and when thinking about their sort of social measures?
Again, there's lots of work being done in this space in the conversations we're having. And that will range from, I think, you have companies where they will have kind of healthcare support programs or healthcare support kind of offerings. And I think, historically, they were relatively basic in some of these areas. I think increasingly kind of the ability for kind of, mental support and mental health support to be part of that package, I think is something that is practically looked for upfront now by both employees, but also the company itself when they're going out and looking for that kind of framework. Equally, there are lots of organizations now that actually invest in programs across businesses to help them improve these areas. So, for example, we've worked with companies where they have external providers that are available for kind of confidential conversations and discussions for employees. We have worked with organizations where actually they're kind of rolling out programs in the widest sense. So rolling out programs, then have people come in and educate those on, financial matters and how to manage money effectively and how to live with the cost of living crisis, and actually help employees through kind of training programs to better understand the pressure points that typically are the things the employees have been struggling with. So it's kind of like, a more proactive campaign to support some of those underlying kind of social factors that might be impacting someone's mental health at work.
Have you seen examples of those driving key output metrics? Because my experience of those, we've experimented quite a lot with those across different organizations. And you sort of see a range of outcomes. Some things just get zero engagement. That's a little bit like the Mayday button on, it was at eBay or Amazon, where apparently no one ever clicked it, but it drove sentiment up massively, just the idea that they could click it. But so we sort of see somewhere there's zero engagement and we're not sure whether it has driven up, just having it there's improved stuff, but we can't see it in the other data that we track. The things that do get a lot of engagement, but actually, again, we can't see any material impact on the key output measures. So I was sort of often left sitting there scratching my head thinking, are we actually moving anything here, or what's going on? Have you seen examples where you've really driven those key output measures? And if so, what are those key output measures that you're driving? I mean, is it employee net promoter score? Is it psychological safety?
I think you're right. So I think sometimes you can't do it always. And certainly, and particularly with something like mental health, there are programs where you say to people, engage with these organizations if you want to, but they will never tell us how many people have spoken to them
Yeah.
or how frequently, because the value of it is completely confidential. So therefore, it is almost kind of, from a company perspective, a slight shot in the dark of saying it's there for you. We hope it helps those that need it, but we'll never ask about it. You use it independently. So I think that's right. The board, exactly as you point out, I think the kind of metrics where you can start to hopefully see some of this come through would again come back to employee sentiment, employee retention, questionnaires asking around kind of employees' desire to stay with the company longer term. Do they see long-term career progression within the organization? Those kind of metrics you can see hopefully tracking in the right direction if you're getting these programs right. But I don't think you'll ever get kind of a one-to-one mapping between a particular program and an outcome, because I think it's just too complicated in most cases to do that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In theory, that makes sense to me. I've just never seen it happen in practice. And often there are all sorts of complexities of mix effects. If you're growing quickly, you've got lots of new people coming in and it's very hard to disaggregate. So I was just curious if you've ever actually seen that sort of one-to-one relationship where an organization has invested into that strand of their social strategy and then actually seen it track through in their metrics.
In terms of improved employee retention, but again, I think certainly the company I'm thinking of where we
starting from a low base,
and also probably did 5, 6, 7, 8 things. So which of those things had the most demonstrable impact? I think almost impossible to say. And I think part of it was almost the sentiment that the business are going and saying, we are fundamentally going to change this and we want to improve it and we're trying our best. And sometimes that's enough for someone to kind of go, okay, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt then, and we'll kind of lean in and kind of commit to this for a bit longer. So very difficult to unpick that, I think, as you say, in a very kind of statistical way. That becomes
interesting. It becomes like marketing, half of its wastage, you just don't know which.
Yeah, you don't know which bit is. Exactly.
I'd like to sort of move on to talking about the sort of the G part, the governance piece. And I think we've talked a bit in the past around compensation, hiring and onboarding. So I'm really interested to focus on a couple of the other areas that you include under that heading around cybersecurity and sort of data and privacy. What are you looking for when, in terms of a data perspective, again, for a board that's doing a good job on its cybersecurity? I find it really difficult to, get my head around as a board member what I should be looking for beyond making sure that people have got the relevant, certification in place. If it's a small company, have they done the cybersecurity essentials program? If it's a larger company, have they done ISO 27001, whatever else it might be? What's your approach to that?
Yeah, so I think absolutely, as you say, that's a very important kind of, starting point is what kind of frameworks do organizations have in place and are they adopting them and adhering to those? And I think they do give a lot of coverage and a lot of protection actually in terms of that confidence. And I think, asking at board level, does this company have this in place and are they kind of adhering to it is a really important question. And then sitting around that will be things like, what's the GDPR policy? Have we had data breaches? Have we been asked for information, that we had any kind of cases where we've been asked for information that we can or can't provide from a data privacy perspective? Do we have the right training in place for our team? Because ultimately, particularly cybersecurity, even with all the right frameworks and policies in place, it comes down to educating your employee base as to what they're doing. And so is that training taking place? How frequently? What are the adoption rates for that or pass rates for that training? Those are really important questions. And what's kind of interesting is I think that they probably already sit there somewhere, right? They sit within the audit committee or the risk committee or the operations committee. There's someone somewhere should be asking those questions. And so you don't need to ask them multiple times in different forums. I think you just need to make sure that they're being asked and tracked on a regular basis. And so I think, and the reason why we see that falling into governance is because clearly in its broadest sense, it's an increasingly important part of every business. And I think, it's part that you can have the best board construct and the most diverse team ever. And if you have that kind of data breach, it's enormous. It's absolutely enormous. If you look kind of beyond that to kind of, what else falls within that remit, I think, again, asking those questions at board level around, what platforms, what technologies are we using and where are the risks, where are the inherent risks within them? And often that won't be with, the large, cloud-based solutions that lots of organizations, the AWSs, the Microsoft Azure cloud, I mean, those are used multinationally by government agencies, and they are, if you're using them properly, they are secure framework where they have backups, they have, data sites, they have backup models. They're very secure.
That's a really interesting one. I'll just jump in there because it's one that's sort of been buzzing around my head recently. Like, it strikes me that everyone's assuming that right now. If AWS goes down, the whole world has gone down. But actually, if AWS goes down, we're all going to look really stupid. And it wouldn't be that difficult to have a backup on Microsoft or Google or whatever else it is. Do you think people are carrying like an unnecessary risk, a single point of failure risk there?
I don't see that as being a huge risk. I think those large scale platforms, they are so, as far as we all know and are told, and whenever I see, I think they are so well engineered to ensure that they already have, multiple backup sites, far more than any individual company could put in place if it tried to do it itself. And actually, so I don't see that being where the biggest risk lies. But where do the biggest risks typically lie in this space? It would be an organization where they actually have some small on-premise solution that only one guy and his dog know how to understand and update, and he goes on holiday or has an accident, and actually you can't do that backup overnight, you can't access that information and content. That's really important. That's where you start to find real challenges here. Another great example is organizations where they're in multiple locations, but it's only one location that ultimately has the key to accessing or unlocking passwords, and suddenly you're in a situation where that location is offline, or it's a bank holiday there, or there's some issue, and suddenly you can't actually get your employee workforce into the right solution at the right time in the geography they're working in. Those, I think, are much more inherent risks within a business. And so I think boards should be asking those questions of their businesses and saying, actually, where are we exposed in terms of solution and software that's not scaled and not robust enough and doesn't have the right backups? And so I think that's a much bigger risk for companies typically. Or where have we kind of over-engineered a solution to do things it shouldn't be doing and using it incorrectly with the risk that comes with that? That for me is far bigger than, we're using a cloud-based AWS server framework, what's the risk of that falling over? Because as you say, if that falls over, then gosh, traffic lights stop working and God knows all the other things that people tell you are going to happen in that scenario. I think it's just beyond the capacity of a particular company to solve.
Really interesting. One of my favorite new additions to our sort of cybersecurity sort of arsenal is we have one of the team who's loves puzzles, games and puzzles, and she's become responsible for our internal phishing attacks. So she simulates these things and they're blooming brilliant, and I'm terrified I'm going to get caught out by them one day. But it's been such a simple change to make, and yet it just gives you that confidence. Each month you see who's been caught out and you can do the education, and it's such a simple thing when people are your biggest risk, to be sort of embedding that within the culture. Are there any other things like that you're seeing across organizations as being just really quick wins, effective wins on sort of cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I think another thing that we're seeing quite a lot is companies actually rolling out much more robust kind of password protection and password reset frameworks. There are now some really very low cost efficient tools that you can roll out that just make you adopt passwords and store them down into your laptops automatically or your PCs automatically. So, it moves away from that risk factor of I've changed my password every 2 months, but I've also written it down on a piece of paper and it's sitting in my wallet next to my laptop, that kind of scenario that we all lived in the past. So I think just simple changes like that are very cost effective, but actually just give an extra layer of security around something as simple as a logon, which again is particularly with laptops, is a really big risk if you're moving and traveling with permission.
Nina, the time has flown by. Time for me to go into the 5-question quickfire where I say a short statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Okay.
So, best book every board member should read and why?
The book I'm reading at the moment is a book called Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. That was written by Paul Pullman, who's ex-CEO of Unilever, and Andrew Winston. So yeah, recommend that read. I think so far I'm loving it.
Your favourite quote and why?
If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
And that's
definitely been my experience so far. I always want to be in a room where I feel outsmarted, learning from others.
Fantastic. Your best ever holiday and why?
Last summer, actually, we did a road trip around France for 2.5 weeks and met up with different people on the way, family and friends, and just saw a huge variety of, the cities, the countryside. Went down to the south and saw the beaches. I think that went to the lakes. I just thought it felt as though we had 5 holidays in one with that car journey, and spending time as a family experiencing that was fabulous.
That sounds amazing. Your most significant professional insight?
I think be really comfortable in yourself. It comes back to that overarching point for me around authenticity and being able to deliver your best when you're confident in what you can and can't do. And I think that's always been what I've tried to do, and what I really appreciate in others is people that can confidently say, I understand this and I can do this well, or I don't understand that, you need to explain it to me before I do it. So it's having that confidence and authenticity in what you can and can't achieve.
And last but not least, your favourite podcast or app if you don't listen to podcasts?
I love podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think The one I listen to kind of every week without fail is The Rest is Politics, but I also think that's so popular that's probably a bit dull. One that I really enjoyed and would recommend is by Tim Harford, The Economist, and Cautionary Tale. So that kind of covers real life scenarios and how people kind of make decisions with the unintended consequences and how that plays out. I think it's really fascinating.
Nina, the time has flown by. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks so much. It's been really fun to chat to you. I hope it'll be helpful.